Well, welcome. I'm Karen Mathis, President and General Manager of KUOW Puget Sound Public Radio. Welcome to our first conversation in our Inside 2020 Salon series. We are so excited to have Mary Louise Kelly, co-host of All Things Considered, with us today, along with our very own local ATC anchor, Kim Malcolm, to unpack what's happening right now and what's on the horizon as we gear up for the 2020 election. The idea for this salon series came from a survey that we sent to our Broadcasters Circle members looking for ideas for virtual gatherings. And I have to confess, I fully expected the feedback to be, please give us a reason to laugh, give us a distraction. But your response was loud and clear. You didn't want distraction. You wanted us to dig into how to navigate the upcoming election in the midst of an active pandemic. But here we are today navigating not only a pandemic, but a ramp up to an election, but massive protests here at home in response to the murder of George Floyd at the hands of law enforcement, and a pattern of inequality, injustice, and violence against Black Americans that has pervaded to the beginning of memory. We can listen to and empathize with one another, but our journeys through this tumult are very individualized and specific to our life experience. And as a Black American myself, this current moment feels like echoes of the past. But I've never felt more grateful for the journalists on the front lines, local and national, many of whom have faced violence and arrest in service of the truth and your right to know. The work of journalists is crucial, but just as crucial is the community that supports them. So thank you. Thank you so much. The generosity of you and thousands of others like you as we're closing out this fiscal year is allowing KUOW to look forward with hope and plans for what else we might cover for you. We're thrilled to bring you not just this one, but three incredible NPR reporters as part of the Inside 2020 series. Mary Louise Kelly today, Tamara Keith on June 11th, and Aisha Roscoe on June 18th. As a journalist, Mary Louise exemplifies KUOW's values of having courage and demanding integrity. Before becoming co-host of All Things Considered, Mary Louise spent a decade as a national security correspondent for NPR News. Her past reporting has tracked the CIA and other spy agencies, terrorism, wars, and rising nuclear powers. Her assignments have found her deep in interviews at the Khyber Pass, at mosques in Hamburg, in a grimy Belfast bar, and this week on the streets of her hometown of Atlanta, covering protests against police violence and racial injustice. I'm sure many of you recall her extraordinary January interview with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and the subsequent fallout after she did her job and challenged him with tough and necessary questions. The incident struck a nerve with me and with many of our listeners because it seemed to exemplify a troubling and escalating pattern of attacks on journalists and the truth. There always has been and will always be people trying to hide from the truth. Journalists work on your behalf to find the facts, to hold power to account, and above all, to protect your right to know. I'm so proud of the essential work KUOW and NPR journalists are doing to serve our community during this difficult time and as we prepare for an historic election. So thank you again for making this work possible. And with that, I'm excited to introduce KUOW's Kim Malcolm and NPR's Mary Louise Kelly. Take it away, Kim.
Aaron, thank you. And Mary Louise, we are very happy to have you here today. Thank you so much for joining us.
To be with you. This is a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you.
Now, for our virtual audience today, we would love to hear from you during this discussion as well. So please share your questions with us in the comments section. I will be monitoring the questions as they come in so they can be included, and we will try to get to as many of your questions as we can today. Well, Mary Louise, you are back now from reporting from Atlanta, your hometown.
Indeed.
During the protests over the death of George Floyd. How did you decide to go there, and what did you want to bring from Atlanta? What was important to you in that?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you again for hosting. I'm happy to be spending my evening in Seattle, where it's considerably cooler, I hope, than the humidity I just flew into in DC. Um, how did we decide to go to Atlanta? It was about the fastest turnaround on a reporting assignment you can imagine, barring, true breaking news where you're usually, you're going to cover a bomb just went off somewhere or something like that. We had been tracking the protests. We have been on total lockdown. I'm speaking to you from my study at home, which is where I've been broadcasting All Things Considered from. I haven't even been allowed to go into our headquarters building since early April. So nobody was traveling. And then the protest just reached this, as we all know, urgency where we're thinking, this is a story that is just gripping the country and we need to get out there. And I am from Atlanta. I grew up there. My first job was as a rookie reporter at the Journal-Constitution there. My family's all still there. So I follow the news closely there. And when I watched what had happened over the weekend there, I was struck because Atlanta is used to protests. It is the cradle of the civil rights movement, as many people there we were interviewing were pointing out. And I was just so curious about how this moment was unfolding there. The birthplace and the burial place of Martin Luther King, who, as we all know, was an advocate of peaceful protest and nonviolent confrontation. And I was curious, what are they preaching from Ebenezer Baptist Church this weekend? Like, how's that going down in this city where we all watched the mayor, Keisha Lance Bottoms, come out and give this impassioned speech and say, this is not Dr. King's legacy. So that was what got me thinking. And of course, the Ahmaud Arbery case in South Georgia has added an extra layer. People were already tracking this before the George Floyd news broke last week. And so I reached out to editors Sunday morning and said, the story is everywhere. We need to be on the ground. It's time to get a host out. Let's do it.
Okay. So it was your idea.
Yeah.
It was your idea. Yeah.
It was my idea. My colleague on Morning Edition, Noel King, had just landed in Minneapolis, so that was not the place to go. And I just thought, Atlanta's interesting. Let's see if we can go. And the next day, Monday, we were on a plane. So it was very, very, very quick. We landed Monday night and went straight out into the protests and started interviewing people.
Well, and I think it was a great thing for listeners and for NPR as well, because of your connection there, your deep knowledge. You're able to bring something to that reporting there. That
it's the value of having people on the ground, and in an ideal world, not just parachuting in, but being able to look and see this street looks really different than it usually does, which is something, if you've never seen it before, you can't do. So that was helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've heard the term inflection point more than once this week. And between the ongoing protests over police brutality in Atlanta, across the country, and continuing impacts from the pandemic, all of this is heading towards the November election. I want to touch on the protests briefly and the election. How are you thinking the demands that we're hearing from protesters and this new revitalized focus on systemic racism, how is that going to play out during this election season, do you think?
I don't think this is something that's going to go away and 2 weeks later we won't be talking about it. And the way that so many things have, because, as we all know, we're living through the biggest news story of our times already with the pandemic and the economic crisis and the presidential election year. And we've had plans being announced today from Al Sharpton, speaking at the memorial service for George Floyd in Minneapolis, talking about a march on Washington, which I think would, if it comes off, would be a day or two after the Republican National Convention, if that happens, is scheduled to unfold. This suddenly becomes one of the defining issues of this election, which I don't know that we're expecting. But yes, to your point about inflection point, I wake up every morning and some mornings feel very hopeful and other mornings feel, just to be honest, sadness at all we have lost It almost knocks me down some days, and trying to figure out, it's my job to try to find words powerful enough to tell that story. And there are some days where you feel like you hit it, and some days where you think, I got to get up again and try it again and try it again the next day. It's hard.
What gets you through on those days when it's hard and it's sad and you still have to show up and do the job?
I am eternally grateful for having the kind of job where it's really not a choice, where producers will hunt me down and we have to get 2 hours on the air every day, whether I feel up to it or not. It's going to happen. So you might as well give it your best shot every day because you're there. But I had this moment where I just really stopped and thought, getting on the plane for the first time in months, getting to travel this week, and my producer had gone by NPR to pick up all of our gear before we went, and we, knew that we were going to need to bring Clorox wipes and gloves and N95 masks and all the rest. And I was planning to travel carry-on, and she shows up, and we are traveling with full body armor and helmets and goggles, and I've traveled with that stuff before, but going into Iraq, going into Afghanistan,
Right.
going into declared war zones, and to get on a plane to my hometown, to get on a Delta flight and fly into Hartsfield Airport in Atlanta, thinking I'm going to need this stuff in the trunk of my car. It took me a minute
to process that.
Yeah, to go find a new suitcase and put it in there and think, these are the times we are living through. To say nothing of the fact that, as a journalist, we are trained, as you know, to be the ones who run toward the chaos. And I was on a plane to Atlanta, and I'm looking at what's happening in Washington. Monday night was the night at Lafayette Square when President Trump came up and held up the Bible. And as I'm landing, I'm getting messages from editors saying, maybe we might need you back in Washington tomorrow. We sorted it out, but it speaks to just the onslaught of defining events of our time, and they seem to come at us every damn day.
Yeah, absolutely. Which, and that is a question for you and for your team at ATC. When things are so compressed, happening, as you say, it's an onslaught, not just daily, but hourly. Things are changing and they feel very momentous. How do you and your team prioritize what you're going to cover and how you're going to cover it?
Yeah, it's a great question. We're old school. For many years, All Things Considered has had a 9:30 a.m. morning meeting, and you show up and you pitch your ideas and we make a plan. I say we're old school because it feels so antiquated, the idea that at 9:30 in the morning we could possibly have a plan that's going to still feel
that'll last,
remotely relevant by 5 or 6 in the evening. It just moves too fast. That worked 10 years ago. It really doesn't work now. What is the alternative? Not to have a plan? Obviously, if we're trying to get reporters on the ground in certain places, we need to get them out the door. And if we're trying to put in interview requests for people, we need to get those requests out early. So there's value to planning, but we spend a lot more time ripping things up and throwing it out. That's one point I would make, is that I am always thinking, one of my fears is that we will be missing the forest for the trees, because there's so many developments. We want to bring you the latest. We want to be on top of everything. But sometimes my line producer is racing into the studio saying, we're gonna pull this and hold it because this just happened. And I'm thinking, okay, but is that actually more important in the grand scheme of things? I know this happened at 10 in the morning, but it still really matters. And people in Seattle and in California and in the West Coast deserve the whole day, not just what happened, in the last 5 minutes of it. So that's one thing on our mind. I will say I look at the 2 hours of All Things Considered and often think, is there an opportunity? Is there any prospect that I will laugh or smile at any point in that hour? Because if I'm not, you're not. And there has to be, doesn't have to, you don't need to have yucks on in a week like this week. It's not, I don't mean we need to do silliness at the expense of serious things that need to be covered.
No, but humanity.
opportunities for humanity.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's not a terrible thing. You know, now, especially now, we need opportunities to smile and laugh and seek that relief. So I look at that. I look at, you know, that those calls I was getting from editors on Monday night, you might need to get on a plane back to Washington Monday. Those come in and have relentlessly since 2016. I'm good friends with a couple of journalists here who moved to Jerusalem in 2016 to go be Jerusalem bureau chief for the New York Times, and they gave up and came home because they kept saying the story is in Washington. It's impossible to leave Washington. How could, if you're a journalist, the story is always here, and it is easy to succumb to just becoming very inside the beltway because there is this relentless fire hose of news here, all of which needs to be covered and fact checked and analyzed and put into context. But I also will go through just looking at the rundown for all things considered and look at it and think, hang on, there's not a single, we have a huge international desk. That is our crown jewel at NPR, is that we have correspondents all over the world. There's nothing outside of Washington to show.
Yeah.
We need, some of this needs to hold, or needs to go to morning edition, or needs to run tomorrow. We need to make space to get you out in the world. And out of the just, as I say, just the fire hose of news that is coming out of, frankly, the White House every single day. And that is hard to try to figure out, you know, every twist and turn of that. If you cover it, then you're not covering something else. There's 2 hours is a long show, but it is not infinite, and that we triage stuff every day. So right. I'm always looking at that and thinking, do I ignore it? Is that the responsible thing to do? Do I cover it, fact check it, give it context? But then again, you're not hearing what happened in Moscow today, or in Nairobi, or in Minneapolis, or in Seattle, because it can't just be that all the time. So that's a challenge.
It is a challenge, and it's a conscious decision. Helps to have teammates to try and work on the balance. So, just a reminder for our listeners and viewers, if you have questions for Mary Louise Kelly during this hour, please share your comments, your questions right now in the comments section, and we will work on working them in. Mary Louise, this pandemic, the angles, there's so many different threads to follow. Are there some that you think are particularly interesting that may not get as much coverage as you think they deserve?
That's a good question. It's the question we're always asking ourselves, trying to figure out, you know, how to just, there's this infinitely huge story that has upended every inch of our lives. I did a story. It was fascinating and also really frustrating and unsatisfying about a week ago, where we just took stock of all of the things that we still don't know. You know, we were exactly 3 or 4 months after the first death in the US, February. So I guess we were 4 months out. And there's still so many just basic questions about how it spreads and who's spreading it that are relevant looking back to try to understand, but also really relevant as we all start to emerge slowly from our homes and crawl back out into the daylight a little bit as things start to reopen. And we're trying to make decisions about our behavior and our risk. So some very basic questions are still open. You know, how does it spread? Who's spreading it? What are my risks? Can you get it again? If you've had it once, are you immune? For how long? And we keep, you know, the best scientists in the world are working on that, and they don't know the answers, but those are ones that intrigue me to keep asking. You know, there's no shortage of conspiracy theories and misinformation on that story, as every other one we cover. So trying to unpack what the facts are, trying to fact check it in real time is a challenge.
Thank you for mentioning that. Misinformation online, that's its own whole category. We're doing a series on it right now at KUOW. But when you talk about fact checking, I we got questions about that from our listeners, and that was a question for me as well. These are new challenges posed under this administration about checking information, fact checking it at a pace and at a speed we had not encountered before. How do you feel NPR and All Things Considered has evolved to meet that? And are we doing a good enough job, do you think?
Well, I mean, we are continuing to evolve, and it is a real and ongoing challenge. We, from the beginning of this administration, have wrestled with it and tried many things, from, during speeches or press conference, having the transcript post and be fact checking it live on our website in real time. This was just said. The correspondent who covers that every day is annotating the transcript with live notes. Mm-hmm. You can do it on Twitter. You can do it on our website. We're doing that. We have done a lot of kind of pre-fact checking and pre-buttals of events when we know what time they're going to start. So State of the Union, starting our live coverage half an hour early, laying out, here are the facts on certain things. Mm-hmm. Here's what you need to know. Cover the event, and then fact check it afterward. It is not perfect because a lot of people aren't listening half an hour before or for the half hour afterward. It's, to be frank, it's a disadvantage that we have at NPR compared to TV, which can do split screen, or can have a chyron going across the bottom, or can show the live thing and then have facts spooling down one side. So we're trying to be creative about it. One very recent innovation, this is coronavirus era, where we've all been working remotely, has been live fact checking for me while doing interviews via Slack. I don't know if you're using Slack at KUOW.
We are. How's that working for you?
Don't tell, I hate Slack. I hate it. It's just too many messaging platforms all at once. However, it has been enormously useful for things like the following. I last month interviewed the director of the CDC, Robert Redfield. Mm-hmm. And you obviously prepare and go in. Inevitably, if I'm interviewing someone like that, he's the expert, I'm questioning him. He knows more about it than I do. That's almost, every interview I do, the person I'm interviewing by definition should know more about it than I do because they're the expert, which is why we're interviewing them. You prepare for it, you know what you're trying to get out of him, but what Slack has enabled us to do is to have, one of our science desk editors and one of our science desk reporters, and I'm in a Slack chat room with them that I can see while I'm interviewing somebody. So I can be at home. The old school way, as you'll know, but I'll just explain it for people listening. 6 months ago, I would be in the studio. My editor would be in the studio. Guest is saying something, I'm trying desperately to fact check it in real time. My editor can whisper in my ear, but you want to keep that to a bare minimum because then I can't hear what the guest is saying. It's incredibly disruptive. Slack, the head of the CDC can say something, and our science correspondent, who's just maybe done a series on that exact point, can ping me something saying, that's true, but in 6 other cases, this happened. And I can, in real time, you don't want to cross a line where I'm being fed questions. It's my job to have a conversation with somebody and just asking them. But just for the very quick, I can't be an expert on everything. That's what our correspondents are, though. Right. Our science correspondents do know, on a level close to being on par with the people working at CDC. The stuff they're covering it day in, day out, and they, through their reporting, have been enormously useful in suggesting follow-ups while I'm in the middle of an interview, and that has been great and is useful in things like this. You don't get it, when you're at the State Department with Mike Pompeo, you're on your own. Yes. But for things like this, where we're in studio and I have a computer, that has been very, very helpful. It's like having an army of experts just right there helping me. So crowdsourcing the fact checking is, I guess, the best way to put it.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, it's a work in progress for sure. But yeah, very interesting. And as you say, it's an evolving art, and we are doing our best to stay on top of it. So you brought up Mike Pompeo, our Secretary of State. You ended up being almost part of the story after you had that interview with him earlier this year, which is not a position you would often find yourself in. It's not a position many journalists would want to be in. He was quite aggressive towards you after the mics were turned off, and later on he claimed that you had lied while setting up the interview. You had not. You had the emails to prove it. A listener touched on this with a question. They wanted to know, how did you stay so calm in that moment? He was a large man. He was speaking loudly, I understand.
He was angry. You know, it's the job. You go in, you be professional, you do your job. It's something to be called a liar by the Secretary of State on official State Department letterhead, and to be sworn at in his office, and to be challenged to find Ukraine on a map. Not the direction I was expecting that interview to go. But this is what we do. This is what I came to do, is to put questions that deserve answers, that everybody out there listening deserves an answer to people in positions of power, and hold them to account. And I think you stay calm because you know you're there doing your job, that the questions were fair, they were rigorous, they were fair, they needed to be asked. If they're not getting answered, you ask them again. In an interview like that, I always go in immaculately prepared, knowing that I had kind of 2 or 3 questions I actually really wanted to know the answers to. It's the only questions I went in with, was 2 or 3 questions, but thinking, what is he going to say? And being prepared to fact check it in real time. And in that case, the interview itself was newsy and was interesting. What made it global headlines was what happened afterward, when he called me back into his office and swore at me for about the same length of time as the interview itself, because he did not want to be asked about Ukraine. Which was curious to me in the moment, since I had confirmed with his staff that I would ask about Ukraine, and also because, you know, if we cast our mind all the way back 47,000 news cycles ago to January, we were in the middle, the Senate was in the middle of an impeachment trial of the President of the United States centered on Ukraine. And Mike Pompeo is the Secretary of State. He was on the July 25th, the famous July 25th phone call that put the whistleblower complaint and put everything in motion. So the idea that even if I had not told his staff, I'm going to ask about this and put it in writing, the idea that was out of bounds is curious to me. You know, afterward, our plan had been that if he made any news in the interview, I would race with Michelle Kellerman, our State Department correspondent, and the editors and producers who were with me to our booth at the State Department and file for morning edition, because this was a morning interview. And we did, a little bit later than we were planning, because I was not expecting the detour to his private living afterward. It was, I think, the only time in the United States I have ever been worried about the tape, by which I mean, you know, I've been in places, Russia, North Korea, where you do an interview and you're immediately taking the sound card and like putting it in your bra or something. You're worried that they might take it.
You were worried about that?
I was worried about that inside the State Department, that they would not want that interview to be broadcast. So we took it down, we uploaded it immediately from the State Department booth and went live on Morning Edition. Did not talk about the whole coda to the interview and the map test until all things considered, because I wanted to think carefully about how we handled that. And in the end, it's the tried and true rules hold. You say what happened. You don't. Nobody cares what I think about it. It wasn't my opinion of it. It was the facts, and I felt that they were newsworthy. And we put them on the air and let them stand.
Yeah. but it was perceived, and I think it was an attack on a journalist, on journalism even, which is something that we have seen and heard more of in recent times. And we are now heading into an election. Is there anything you take from that encounter and the approach that you and your team are taking as you head into the election when it comes to what our job is as we head into the election?
Yeah, I mean, I remember in the moment, again, to answer our listener's question about staying calm, I will say as I was sitting being sworn at in his office, I do remember distinctly thinking, I'm so glad I work for NPR, because this is going to be a doozy of trying to figure out how I deal with this on air, because I don't have my tape recorder in here. They told me to leave it. They didn't say this was off the record, and it was not, but I don't have a recorder. And there's 3 people in the room: the Secretary of State of the United States, me, and a press aide who works for him, who's kind of off in the corner, I think, wishing she were anywhere on the planet other than that room. It's going to be his word against mine. How do we handle this? And I was very grateful to work at NPR. In that moment, was thinking it even in real time, because I have such smart editors and colleagues and lawyers, and was so grateful not to be a freelancer in that moment, to be honest.
Right.
To have the support of an organization that would have the resources to handle the blowback that I was already starting to think about, and that would stand with me. And help me think through the best way to handle it. And that goes a long way toward keeping you calm in the moment, knowing I'm here, I'm doing my job, this is what I'm paid to do, and my organization will have my back. And they did. To your question, I mean, and you kind to your point about attacks on journalists, that, and the fact that I had to pack body armor to go to Atlanta to cover a protest this week. Those are 2 kind of interesting, the start of the year and where we are now, 5 months later, to tell you what it's like to be a journalist in this country. I think my takeaway is we keep doing what we're doing. We keep asking the questions. We keep not backing down when we don't get answers. We keep broadcasting it. We keep fact checking it. We keep going out and seeing things firsthand. I mean, we've watched the debate. I don't even want to use the term debate, because there's no debate over what happened on Monday night in Washington, D.C. this week, and the administration then coming out and saying no tear gas was used.
Yeah, there's proof.
Journalists there witnessed it.
Yeah.
It happened, but if you're not there, you don't see it. And that, I think, informed some of my push to get out and cover these protests in person this week. If you're not there, you don't know, you can't see it, you don't have the proof. And you can't try to correct all of the crazy misinformation that is out.
Right.
On every story, but particularly trying to cover this administration. So yeah, it's being out there. It's continuing. I know, and I'm sure we'll get questions on this, the huge push that people feel for journalists not to do both siderism, not for us to, the debate over the Tom Cotton op-ed that just came out in the New York Times. He has a point of view. He's an elected official. He's in a position of power to do something about his point of view. Should we read that point of view or not? And that's a separate debate that we can have. But I will say I feel it every day. I feel it in my Twitter feed and my email inbox and my voicemail inbox every day. Why did you put this person on air? Why are you playing this from the president? Just ignore it. There are strong arguments to be made for different ways of handling this. There's no right way, universal right way on every story every day for every newsroom. That's the correct answer. And we will all be making missteps as we go. But I know that we have done deep thinking in the NPR newsroom about how we covered 2016, how we've covered this administration, going into this campaign, which has been upended by the pandemic. I mean, I was supposed to be headed to Minneapolis for the Democratic convention. That's not happening. It's unfolding in unpredictable ways, hour by hour.
Yeah.
My personal view is that there are plenty of talking heads on the cable news channels to tell you what they think and what you should think. And that is not my job. I don't know that anybody cares what I think. Who cares? I'm a reporter. Every single person listening to this is capable of making up their own mind. I understand that there are decisions inherent in just which facts we choose to present, which people we're choosing to interview, what questions we're choosing to ask them. Absolutely. Nothing is neutral, and we're not trying to be neutral. We are trying to be fair, and we're trying to be serious.
Yeah.
We're trying.
We're trying. Yes, we're humans. Yeah, and there is context we always work to provide, and and hopefully when we mess up, we own it. And I think actually, strangely, owning up to our mistakes and being transparent about it actually helps to build trust.
We had a huge. I was not there because I was on the plane to Atlanta, but Monday night, a big debate was unfolding apparently over whether to cover the president's remarks live, the Hold Up the Bible at St. John's Church remarks live. We didn't know what he was going to say. It was pretty clear it was going to be inflammatory. It was pretty clear it was going to be news, and people have been waiting for the president to speak. Unlike cable news, if you're CNN, you can just decide we're going to cover it and then resume your normal programming. As you know, we're tied to an all things considered clock, where if we take the president live, we're upending and going into special coverage. And that is, there's all kinds of challenges involved with that, not least of which is, again, it means all of the other things that we thought were important enough to put on the show that day are getting checked out the window, and you're never going to hear them in the West Coast, because you're getting the president. But there was a big debate, and we did end up carrying him live, and I don't actually know what that aftermath debate has been over whether that was the right call and we would do it again. I tend to think it was news, and we're in the news business, and then you come on and analyze the hell out of it and fact check it and everything else. But these are, however, what are we, nearly 4 years into this administration, we are still very much, there are strong views on this, and it lands different ways on different days.
Yeah, absolutely. And our station had an encounter with that debate also back in March, when we, as NPR was as well, carrying the presidential press briefings live that he was doing at the
White House task force briefings. All day.
Exactly, on the coronavirus, exactly. And sometimes they were 45 minutes, sometimes they were up to 2 hours. The flood of fact checking that needed to be done was really became an issue, and the decision was made here by management that the sheer volume of it, we could not fact check in real time and provide a full service for our listeners. So that was a controversial decision.
Yeah.
And but yeah, that's as you say, you can go either way, depending on what the situation is. So again, just again to our listeners, our viewers, I'm monitoring questions for Mary Louise. Don't forget, you can share those comments, those questions right now in the comments section. So Mary Louise, we are heading up to this election, of course. We've been talking about truth, we've been talking about transparency, trying to give context so that people can make up their own minds. A question from one of the listeners was, how can NPR build public confidence in our election system? We've already seen some disputes over vote by mail, which is something we do here in Washington State, past interference in presidential elections by foreign actors. It's an interesting question. I would just append another question, which is building public confidence in the election system. Is that even our job?
Yeah, that was about to be my response. I don't know that it's our job to build public confidence in the election system. Our job is to report on what the flaws and strengths and challenges that all of our election officials are facing as they unfold. I was anchoring the live coverage the night of the Iowa caucuses.
Mm.
Um,
Does anyone even remember that now?
8 million news cycles ago, way back.
There were a lot of problems with the vote coming in, if anybody forgets. Yeah.
Exactly. It was an interesting night because we had committed, we were going to stay on the air, hold the air for special coverage until we got the results, which we were thinking, I can't, 9, 10, 11 o'clock East Coast time. Needless to say, we never got the results from the Iowa elections because, speaking of things that should not prompt confidence in the electoral system, you'll recall that the whole system crashed and we never got results that night. And finally, around 1 in the morning, I was looking at the director saying, I don't know that we want to do this until Morning Edition comes in.
Anyone?
It's been a night. We're not going to stay on until we get the results. And we called it around 1 in the morning and said, we're out. But yeah, I mean, that to me kind of set the tone. I think about that. I think about, I was in Russia reporting in 2016 when the news broke that the DNC had been hacked. It was June of 2016. And at the time, I didn't even think it was that big a story. I was resisting even filing for newscast about it because I had covered cybersecurity and thought, of course the Russians and everybody else are trying to feel around and hack people's emails. And the scope of it was not immediately clear to me or to many of us that this was the path we're headed on. And by all accounts, that continues. Other adversaries have got their hands in the mix. So there's foreign interference. There's our own problems with voter suppression and efforts to strike voters from the rolls going on the local level. There's the tech issues here, just like we saw in Iowa. There's now a pandemic layered on top of it, and looking at trying to figure out how we very quickly shift almost everybody to voting by mail. And not have long lines at polling stations.
If that's even possible, yeah.
And then there are the very real questions being raised. The White House, President Trump has dropped hints about, we had Jared Kushner come out and say, we're planning to hold an election in November.
We're planning.
If it doesn't go their way, do they recognize the results? I mean, there are some possibilities here that I would never have imagined we would be discussing had you asked me a few years ago, and here we are. So there are many legitimate reasons to be worried. I think the best thing that we can do as journalists is to be raising those questions early and often, really pushing every senator and member of Congress we interview, every governor, every local official who has it within their power to do something now to try to make sure that, because it feels, it goes without saying and is always true, but we do not need a disputed election this year. Just like, we have enough going on. Let's have an election, let's get a result, let's get it done. So to the extent that we can flag and question and point out what challenges are and be covering those relentlessly right now. I know that we have reassigned certain people and created new beats and probably should be continuing to do that. It's hard because there's, resources are never infinite, and they certainly are not now. And we are really, really stretched trying to cover what we're covering. But this is important. It really matters. It is on our radar. I know we're hitting it. We had a story on last night. We'll be covering it just, day by day by day by day by day. It's important.
Yeah. Another election-related question, actually about the campaign and President Trump. Any thoughts from you on how? Well, it's so interesting, the juxtaposition. You're at home on Zoom. Everyone you work with is at home. Reporters are working remotely. Meanwhile, President Trump is working hard, trying to figure out how to have rallies or something that approximates rallies. How do you think he's going to? How do you think he's going to navigate that? The listeners looking for.
No, I'm really curious. I don't know. I mean, he's already kind of restarted. We've seen a couple of events recently, taking this week's unusual events out of the mix, but just where he's traveled and been talking to people and had crowds. I don't quite know how that will unfold. I'm deeply curious. I mean, we're waiting to see what happens with the conventions, and that might give us some insight into just gatherings, what that's going to look like.
Yeah.
I mean, I hesitate ever to predict the future, but I find it hard to imagine that we will not have a fall where we're seeing rallies and the president, because that's what he loves, that's what he does, he'll be out there. I don't know how it works with masks and social distancing and all of the rest of it. I was thinking that when I saw Al Sharpton today announcing that he and the King families and others are going to do this big march on Washington in August, and thinking, great, okay, but really, how does
Right.
a huge march on Washington, how does that work in the COVID era? I don't know.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Well, we'll just keep rolling with the punches. And I know that it's a priority with the folks you work for to keep you safe, as it is here for us at KUOW as well.
But yeah, it's I mean, we had sunk a lot of resources. This is January, February, I'm talking, into something we were calling the MAP project. We had just rechristened it with some much better name, which eludes me at the moment, but it was basically getting every host in the network out, assigned to a city or a state or a certain place, and going there just over and over and over, starting in February with the caucuses and primaries, and going there through the election. I was assigned to Philly, which I'm deeply embarrassed to say almost spent almost no time in. I'm on the train through there all the time, but almost never there, and really was excited to go and just get to know a bunch of voters and keep coming back to them and cover the issues as they were unfolding in different parts of the country. That fell by the wayside when the coronavirus hit, because no one was allowed to travel and couldn't do face-to-face interviews anyway, so there was no point. And now we're trying to figure out, what does that look like now?
Right.
It's still not safe to travel. It's still not really safe to go in people's houses. We don't want to put anybody in danger. And the whole landscape of what the election looks like and what people care about, if you're asking people what's on their mind and what the issues are, I think it must look radically different to almost all of us than it did in February. With certain key things that are there and should be there, climate change, race and criminal justice, that's obviously front and center. But things that are just climate change being the obvious big one, not even getting talked about in this moment, which is crazy.
I mean, is that a problem for us? I mean, I know you hash out story ideas with the team every day in that 9:30 meeting. Does that ever come up, like some pushback? Okay, yes, there's so much stuff happening in Washington right now, but we've got climate change also.
Yeah.
How does that conversation get managed?
Yeah, it happens every single day. It's, I mean, two thoughts on it. One is, it is so enormously useful to have, and we're not perfect, but a reasonably diverse staff. In that you just can't get away with doing just only, all inside the Beltway political stories every day. Not that that is what I would be advocating either, but our team brings story ideas to the table where I'm thinking, where did that feels so out of left field. I would never have thought about that, but it's pretty interesting, and we should be covering. I haven't heard it anywhere else. Yeah, why not? Let's do it. That is enormously useful. And I say that again, I want to emphasize we're not where we would like to be in terms of diversity, but we are really trying, and you really feel it at the table in terms of the input and what people are excited about and pushing. And it keeps, it does definitely keep different story ideas on the table. We also, I think one thing we do that is good is doing series of things. So I was supposed to be in Russia last week, doing a big international desk series on authoritarianism around the world, and looking at the rise of authoritarian leaders, looking at how that looks from different parts of the world as they look at us and as we look at them, and just looking at our democracy through the lens of other countries. Those are big, expensive enterprise stories to pull off. But if you commit to it and say, we're going to do this series, then it gets on our air. And that has also been reined in by the pandemic, but I hope will be resurrected when we can travel and when maybe we have some travel budget again. There's the health issue, and then there's the fact that newsroom resources are stretched so tight. But that helps, just carving out space on the board and saying this is walled off, and I don't care who tweets what today. We have decided this is a priority.
Yes. Give me the space to actually follow through and finish with this.
It's hard. I mean, I had a debate with senior editors, which I lost a year and a half ago. I had come back from North Korea reporting. Nobody gets to
remember that trip.
It was insane. And we brought back all this great tape and had this great story, which we'd promoted to fill the whole A segment, 11 minutes on a Friday. And then some twist this was when the Mueller probe was still going, and it was some headline that felt incredibly urgent at the time, which we'd all forgotten about by Monday. And they were like, we can't hold the A segment for North Korea. We've got to go cover what Rod Rosenstein just said. And I fought the good fight, just saying, really? Because that will still be happening on Monday, but we have this thing from North Korea that nobody has got. Let's do it. It was fine. We all, it ran on Monday in all its glory, and it was all fine. But those wanting to be on top of the Washington story is a relentless and needs to be done. But yeah, the walling off the space and saying this is mine, and go knock yourselves out on Morning Edition with whatever just happened today at the Justice Department.
We're doing this.
Yeah.
I've only got a couple of minutes left with you, Mary Louise, and I do want to note that you are a published author. When you and I met for the first time, you were on a book tour.
True. And
as you say, millions of news cycles ago. A listener, a viewer sent this question in. Is there a book that you've read lately that's a favorite of yours that maybe you admire or is taking your just giving you a bit of a break right now from the
That's a great question. I'm trying to think of the many things that I'm reading at the moment.
Oh, do you have like a stack by your
I do.
bookmarks?
I have a stack. And what makes a really interesting conversation on NPR is not necessarily the best read that I'm yearning to get to off my bedside table. Fiction can be really hard to do on radio.
Yes.
Because by definition, if I'm talking about it on air, it's because it's just been published, so nobody's read it, and you don't want to give away the ending, and nobody cares about the characters because they haven't read it, so you're trying to figure out what can I talk about in here. Nonfiction can be a lot more interesting. I just finished Lawrence Wright's book, the end of October. Lawrence Wright, New Yorker writer, won the Pulitzer for writing about Al-Qaeda in his book, The Looming Towers. He has taken a foray into fiction and written this super spookily prescient novel about a killer virus that sweeps the world, which you would think would be the last thing you
Mary Louise, that's not light reading.
But it's a total page turner, and you read it and you're like, he predicted all of it. It's a great read because he's a good storyteller. It's also, I found myself getting mad reading it, thinking this guy who's a great journalist, but again, an Al-Qaeda. I mean, he won the Pulitzer for Al-Qaeda. He knows nothing about pandemics and viruses. He's not a scientist. And yet he managed to predict almost everything we're living through just by doing some research and asking some smart questions. Like, we should have seen this coming. We should have been prepared. But it is a great summer page turner on the beach. So I will give you that. And I'm trying to think if there's another one that I would recommend.
I know it's hard when there's a whole stack.
I find myself going back to classics in this moment as well. I just was rereading Flannery O'Connor, who I had not read in many years, and she's as great and as creepy and as weird and as just smart and gorgeous a writer
Yeah.
as I'd remembered. And it's that experience we've all had of something you read when you were very young, and then you pick it up in a
Right.
different moment, and you're having a totally different experience. So
Mhm.
I'm a big fan of going back to the classics in this moment and just being reminded the world was crazy and wild and difficult and heartbreaking and always has been. And there are characters out there, to our point about humanity. To read something that somebody who's long gone wrote decades ago that touches you now, is
Yes,
powerful in this moment.
it is.
We'll get through it. We're gonna get through this.
We will. We will do this together with our listeners. Mary Louise, it's been such a pleasure. I thank you so much for your time and for sharing some of yourself with us and our listeners.
Thank you for great questions. Thank you all for joining us. This has been fun. Thank you.
Mary Louise Kelly is the co-host of All Things Considered, NPR's award-winning afternoon news magazine. I want to again thank all of the attendees joining us virtually, for which all of this, you make it possible. We value your support, which is ongoing and is more important to us now than ever. If you feel inspired to make a gift or to renew your support at this time, I invite you to go to kuow.org/donate. Now, if you haven't already, consider registering for the next two discussions in this Salon series. On June 11th, NPR's Tamara Keith will speak with KUOW's Patricia Murphy. And on June 18th, Aisha Roscoe will virtually sit down with KUOW's Austin Jenkins. We will post RSVP links to these in the chat and over email after the event. I hope to see you all in person someday, but until then, virtually is going to have to do. Thank you and good night.